Woodward and Bernstein and the Washington Post brought down a president in 1974. The Boston Globe's investigation into child sexual abuse in the Catholic Church had big consequences. Reporters in San Diego dug deep into the San Onofre debacle and sounded the alarm about the reemergence of whooping cough. But can we keep it up? What's going on with investigative reporting in our newsrooms today? I'm Mark Sauer. A special edition of the KPBS Roundtable starts now. Welcome to our discussion of investigative reporting on this special edition of the KPBS Roundtable. I'm Mark Sauer. And joining me today are Lori Hearn, director and editor of iNewsSource. Hi, Lori.
Hi, Mark.
Good to have you back. Investigative journalist Joanne Farian. Hi, Joanne.
Hi, Mark.
Welcome back to the show. Good to see you today. And watchdog reporter Jeff McDonald of the San Diego Union-Tribune. Hey, Jeff.
Hi, Mark.
How are we doing today? And investigative journalist J.W. August of NBC7 San Diego. Hi, J.W.
Hey, Mark.
Glad to have you here today. Well, the new movie Spotlight is drawing raves from reviewers and veteran journalists alike. It's the true story of how the Boston Globe exposed the widespread sexual abuse by priests in heavily Catholic Boston. Let's listen to a bit of the movie's trailer.
I'm hoping we can keep this between us until we all get on the same page.
Is that why we're here, to get on the same page? We've got two stories here. A story about degenerate clergy, and a story about a bunch of lawyers turning child abuse into a cottage industry. Which story do you want us to write? Because we're writing one of them.
Well, we're getting a lot of buzz on that movie. Lori, start by telling us what kind of person is drawn to investigative reporting? What's the makeup of a journalist who wants to get into this?
Well, I think the general qualifications for a journalist, period, are basically a lot of curiosity and a healthy dose of skepticism. And investigative journalists are really a special breed. They have to be able to be persistent and stand the test of verification, meticulous verification, and not just believe what someone tells them. They have to be able to check everything out, document everything, get the data, really verify again everything that they hear or find. There's an old adage in the journalism business, which I'm sure you all have heard, and that is, if your mother tells you she loves you, check it out. Investigative journalists take that to the nth degree.
All right, now we're all experienced folks here. We've all done our share of investigations. I had a Q&A recently I was asked to participate in following a screening of Spotlight. The questions from all these folks were for me as a journalist, what's going on today? Shrinking budgets, shrinking newsrooms, staff. What's the situation with investigative journalism today? Is it dying? I'll throw that out to the panel. Joanne, start with us.
Well, I think at KPBS iNewsSource, the answer is no. I mean, we do have organizations now, like iNewsSource, these small nonprofits that are partnering in public media newsrooms all across the country. I really think that that's going to help save investigative journalism. I can't speak so much for larger newsrooms or commercial newsrooms as to what's happening, but I think this model is something that we see is working. It could work.
The newspapers, J.W.?
Well, on the commercial end of investigative reporting for commercial entities, it kind of comes and goes in popularity. It depends on who is the consultant talking to the people. I've been at news stations where it was the next big thing, and then I've been there where they try to forget that you're there. So I think it goes up and down. I think it's alive and vigorous. It's just its form has changed.
Well, Jeff, speaking from a newspaper standpoint, and of course we're both UT, you're still there. I was there for many years. Those staffs have shrunk down. We just don't have anywhere near the bodies in newspaper newsrooms.
Incredibly smaller than it was when I arrived. I was telling someone earlier, it's probably 1/5 the size of the newsroom when I first was hired. That said, we do have a committed team doing investigative work now, which we didn't have when I arrived, which I think is pretty cool. I think the readers and the feedback the publishers and the top managers get is that there's a market for investigative journalism. People want to read that. That's what they expect from their local news organization. So while it's troubled, while the news industry in general, but newspapers in particular, are transitioning based on the digital world, I think there's a re-emphasis on investigative work that we're all contributing to the community by doing.
but the numbers are so down. Joanne?
I think the bigger problem is it shouldn't be one or the other. We shouldn't have these small teams who do investigative journalism and we wait to see what they find out, and then everybody else does what. I think that journalism, by nature, should be finding the truth, and sometimes that takes longer. And so I think the problem is, more of the problem is if you're a reporter in a newsroom, the demands that are placed on you, especially in the digital age, in terms of all of the sort of content you have to produce, kind of takes away from your ability to do good journalism and deep dive journalism. And so I don't think that I think the problem is more that we sort of delineate it this way, that there's a little team that does this kind of journalism and everybody else does, aren't really given the time or the tools.
I would say some journalists are more suited for this work than others. I mean, some journalists are happy being beat reporters, and what they do in covering the daily news is important. People need that information. I agree with you, though. I think that part of the problem today is this rush for 24/7. Everybody wants to be ahead of each other. Everybody wants to be on top of the latest thing. And investigative journalism takes a lot of time. And as a result, it takes a lot of money, because the people who do it may produce 1 or 2 stories a year, perhaps. Maybe they're gangbuster stories, but...
Right.
And I'd say the team concept works for both the large commercial media, because what you do is have a smaller dedicated group of journalists that work on that, and they have usually additional protections from outside forces that try to change the type of stories you cover. So project teams, I think, is a
There's some
one
advantages
tool.
to that.
There's a tool to that.
All right, Joanne, let's stay back with you now here. We want to talk about some specific stories out of our newsrooms. And in 2010, California had this epidemic of whooping cough. Start by what made you look into that story, and where did you start with that one?
Well, I was actually in a morning meeting in the newsroom, and a news release came across that said San Diego County is experiencing an epidemic of whooping cough. And so 2 things went off. I'm a mom, and I was fairly familiar with the immunization schedule. I knew that this is something that you're immunized against. And also I thought, isn't this an illness that back in the olden days people got it? It's not something you get now. So I was just curious. And to sort of address what we were just talking about, I was lucky enough back then that I was working on a team where we got to basically pick and choose things we were going to work on and spend time pursuing them. So I thought, I'm going to look into whooping cough. And I got on the email list with the county health department, and daily got their news releases that would say, 4 or 5 people got whooping cough today. At the bottom, they would list their age, and then they would list their immunization status. And after a few weeks of this, noticing that almost all of them had been immunized, I filled out a Public Records Act request and asked for all the data, added it all up, basically. All of the people who got whooping cough that year, how many had been immunized, and it turned out at least 2 out of 3 had been. So it was simply adding the numbers and paying attention.
So what's going on with this vaccine became the big question.
Well, at first, public officials, and they continue to say this, they continue to say it's because people aren't being immunized, because to question a vaccine is taboo, because everyone perceives it as an anti-immunization story, which it never was. So I was up against both those things. Basically, health officials saying, we don't want you to report this story, not directly saying that, but discouraging it, because then people would think it meant you don't have to vaccinate your kids. And the second thing, because it was about science and medicine, I had, in fact, at one time, the CDC telling me you're asking stupid questions.
All right, we do have a clip from your original report. Let's hear that.
In California last year, teens between the ages of 14 and 16 accounted for almost a quarter of all whooping cough cases. An iNewsSource analysis of state data shows where the immunization status of those teens is known, nearly 3/4 had received all of their required doses.
The vaccine doesn't work as well as we thought it was. Even though we know it's not the best vaccine, it's even less effective than we thought.
See, that was years later, right?
That was years later, you said, huh?
Yes, so in 2010, nobody would say that. Yeah. Nobody would go and say the vaccine isn't working. I had to go to the Netherlands to find a scientist who was willing to say that. That was years later, after studies were done some of them, as a result of our reporting, where now doctors and scientists are willing to say, oh, we don't think the vaccine works as well as we thought it did.
So that was a pretty good successful outcome on that particular story.
I think Lori can address this as well. We were working together on this. Years later, we can say it was successful, but I know, didn't you went to other organizations to say, do you want this story? And they didn't believe it. They didn't believe the reporting.
In the very beginning, we were trying to make sure that the story got the biggest audience possible, particularly in California, because that's where we'd done the analysis. And I was shopping the story to newspapers up and down the state and to television stations, and they came up with these reasons why they didn't want to run it. We were a fairly new organization at the time, but I know now that they were afraid of the story. I mean, we were questioning big, important pharma. We were questioning some real social issues here, and I don't think they wanted to touch it. And now you can see it had great effect.
And thank goodness you did that. Let's turn to a more recent investigation. Now, this one regards the multi-billion-dollar deal following the shutdown of the San Onofre nuclear plant. The cost of the premature closing of the failed plant totaled about $4.7 billion, but the deal over who was going to pay that, customers or shareholders, changed at the last minute. In fact, investigations by the press revealed a process that was flawed from the beginning. Here's a clip from our own Amitha Sharma on one of her recent reports on Edison and San Onofre.
The NRC, again, in its own inspection, found that Edison failed to verify the adequacy of its design. San Diego lawyer Mike Aguirre says the company's June 2006 presentation to the NRC is grounds for a federal investigation.
It is against the law for a company to misrepresent material information to a safety regulator. And yet, you have the situation here where, there really was a radiation leak right here in our own backyard because our own companies, were not being straight.
Now, Jeff, that's a different aspect of this very complicated story, and you looked into how this kind of whole deal came about, and what did you learn, and what happened in a far-flung place here?
I am stupefied how much I learned about nuclear power. This story has all the same elements that your story on whooping cough did. Big, powerful interests that conduct business the way they conduct business all day long, every day, every year, for years. And when something like this happens, they simply accommodate for it and adjust their rates. What was unusual is that we learned about it this time, and we were able to draw attention to it. Now, we haven't had any success reversing the rate. What happened is they killed the power plant by accident, and they billed the ratepayers 3/4 of the cost of that failure. The ratepayers, of course, had nothing to do with the plant failure. They cut a deal in secret overseas, they being the top regulator in the state of California and one of the top executives at the company that owns the power plant. And we never would have found out about it if we hadn't just pecked away and pecked away and pecked away. Why is this costing so much? They billed it as a rate savings when they announced the deal to the public a year and a half after they hatched the deal in Warsaw, Poland. They announced it as $1.5 billion savings to ratepayers. And we all reported that. Yeah. And it was only in the ensuing weeks and months where we started picking apart the costs of this, how they actually broke down, that the story started to unravel.
So we've got the head of the state agency supposed to be looking out for the public, and they're cutting a backroom deal with the utility, Southern California Edison.
It's without dispute. It's been acknowledged by the utility. What hasn't been, there's been no impact to that because the commission has not yet reversed its decision or even considered applications for reversing it. People have been saying for most of this year, this deal has to be reversed. It has to be reconsidered, and the commission has refused to acknowledge or take any action on that.
JW did some reporting on this as well. What happens when you get this kind of gotcha moment when you see, my goodness, here's what was really going on?
Well, I saw what Jeff was doing. He did a terrific job, and I knew there was more there. If they were that way with the granting of the license and also with paying for the cleanup, what else was going on the plant and then the plant property? So I decided to focus on the grounds themselves, contaminants, how they handled the radioactive material, and that sort of thing. And that got me off in another direction. It started when I started talking to a safety engineer within the Songs plant, who began to fill me in what was going on and how the NRC worked. And like Jeff, you become an expert. I'm not an expert on the CPUC, but I know I could build a nuke plant because I know
maybe
a
it
lot
wouldn't have the
about
vibrations in the tubes if we got your.
I certainly wouldn't spend the
Let
money.
me know when you
pay
do that.
Mitsubishi.
Let me know when you do that, will you? So I can move back to Detroit. This story's still ongoing, though, and when you do story, you broadcast these stories, you publish these stories in the newspaper, it leads to more, does it not? Folks come out of the woodwork and say, hey, you only know the half of it, right?
That's the story with a lot of investigative journalism. You don't know what you have, you feel like it's not right, something needs to change, you learn about it, and you tell the readers and you show them what happened. Then people start coming out, and they end up building on each other. This story's lasted a lot longer than I expect, and they've been impervious to change, more so than any other institution I've written about in my career.
Lori?
One of the things, too, about it, I mean, you did great work at San Onofre, but one of the things when you talk about building on each other, I think investigative journalists have to be open to possibilities. You can't go in with an agenda. You have to be aware that the data or the documentation or the interviews and the other verification that you get you have to be pivoting the story. Maybe what you initially thought it was is something else. It may be even a bigger story than you realize. So,
or maybe you have to cut loose and say, geez, we spent a lot of time and effort and money on this, but it's not here.
That's possible,
too.
too.
The toughest thing to do is when you invest all that time and energy and you really think you got something and you say, I got to walk away. Yeah, that's tough.
But San Onofre is going to continue. I mean, there's still a lot of stuff. And, of course, the public safety issue, the public cost issue is just enormous here. The stakes are high.
It is. We have the highest electric rates in the nation, except for Hawaii and some northeast states. But, yes, it'll continue until the public makes enough of an outrage where the commission feels pressure from the governor's office to change their decision.
Now, as I said earlier, this was far-flung. You found out about all this in this secret meeting. I mean, it really had the kind of intrigue of a little James Bond stuff there.
Yeah,
Poland.
Yeah, I found out about that looking over the search warrant returns, which is one of the due diligence things we all do. And one of the things that the investigators took when they searched the commissioner's house was RSG notes. And so what that did is it connected the investigation into PG&E, which is under investigation up in San Bruno for killing 8 people. It connected that corruption investigation to San Onofre. So it was much bigger than just limited to PG&E. And in fact, this is how the commission has been doing business for years. Very close-knit to the people they regulate.
And in our case, same thing. NRC documents that had never been seen by the public, you start reading them and you see what they were doing on the property, dumping radioactive material around the property with no regard to long-term health effects. And I'm talking about the 25 acres in and around the plant and just burying the stuff in the ground.
And we had reform bills and the governor is vetoed.
How about that?
So it all gets back to how the system works and whose bread gets buttered by whom, huh? All right. Well, let's shift one more time here to another story that we've looked at here locally in San Diego. This is an investigation into a situation where the safety of school kids was imperiled. It involved hundreds of fire alarms at schools in the Sweetwater district. J.W., what got you looking into this story when you were over at 10 News heading up the investigative team?
We had a woman that worked in the district who was involved in maintenance, and she kept reporting to her supervisors that the alarms aren't working, not just at one school, but multiple schools. Their maintenance people did multiple. They just didn't work in one school. They did all across the district. And district, school after school, the alarms are not working.
A pretty basic thing. We're talking about fire alarms with hundreds of kids in the school.
They had passed this huge bond to spend money, and the item number 2 is it would be used to improve the safety, the fire alarms, everything in all the new schools and the upgrades for all the schools across the Sweetwater School District. So the question was, where's the money going and why are the alarms not working?
All right, and what happened when you confronted you'd think when the alarm was raised, so to speak, the officials would have said, oh my goodness, let's get right on this.
They dug in. They refused to acknowledge it. Even when the police and the fire department went in there and had people walking the hallways because of state law, if the alarms are not working, they have to have somebody on premises to walk the halls. Even when they had fire officials walking the hallways, they wouldn't ignore, the district wouldn't acknowledge you had a problem. It was just, they just buried their head in the sand.
Well, I love your passion on that, and I think all of us have experienced that, where you get a point in the story where, wow, this is really outrageous. This interview, they could have come clean, mitigated it, and said, you know, we're going to do the right thing here. But when they don't, that kind of gets your dander up, does it not, Jeff?
Every organization experiences problems. What defines the organization is how they respond to those problems. So, and I mean, this is the cover-up being worse than the crime in case after case after case. So it's unfortunate. If you had come to them and they'd said, wow, this is terrible, we're going to fix it, I mean, maybe you do a story
and
it
gone.
goes away. Exactly.
One story and gone.
Instead, they dig in Sweetwater.
Right.
Just
end up doing 10
fraught
stories.
with problems at that district for a long time. So
we see that over and over again. So, Lori, we talked early on, and Joanne was mentioning iNewsSource, and we've got ProPublica, Inside Climate News, a lot of examples across the country of these privately funded organizations that sometimes team up with a lot of newspapers and broadcast stations, et cetera. Is that the new model? Is that going to continue? Can we count on investigative journalism thriving there, or what's the future as you see it?
I think the nonprofits are part of the answer. They have grown out of the downsizing of traditional media, particularly areas in traditional media where they've basically outsized their investigative teams. So regional teams have kind of taken the place. The problem is, it's always about the money. You know, it's about the money when you're investigating things, and it's about the money to keep investigative journalism going. The nonprofits, for the most part, survive on foundation funding and philanthropy and memberships like public broadcast.
It's a public broadcasting model,
right?
Pretty much,
Right, and so it's a nonprofit status. It's a 501c3 status with the IRS, and I think they are filling part of the void, but there's always room for more investigative journalism.
You know, I was
just going to say, if I may plug KNSD, my employer, that they now have a culture of investigative journalism because their management in New York believes in it. Okay. They are willing to spend the bucks and build the teams and spend the money and sit on the stories and find the attorneys to review the scripts and go through all of that. And for somebody that does what I do and have a passion for this business, it's a great opportunity.
Joanne?
The public wants it. I was at an IRA conference a couple of years ago.
Tell us what IRA is.
The Investigative Reporter and Editors Conference. And there was a whole panel on, they had done all of these surveys, studies, whatever, and the public wants investigative journalism on television, in their newspaper, on the radio. So we have to do it. We have to do it.
Well, our democracy was founded on a strong, free, and vigorous press. And if we don't have, I mean, really, the whole system was set up that way.
They don't call it the fourth estate for no reason.
That's right. And it's and of course now we've as we said, with shrinking budgets, that is, and smaller newsrooms, it's tougher all the time, and a lot of folks are getting away with stuff. Joanne?
Well, I think you said something really interesting earlier, Jeff, about pecking away at things and building on things, and that in the end, what it's taken me a long time, but I realize that tends to be how it works now, is that you don't write that one giant story or produce that one television story that says everything that kind of, you know what you have right away. Right. You often don't know what you have to begin with. You're just starting out, you put it out there, and it builds and it builds and it builds. And Lori and I have worked on a few investigations like that. Melrose Tax, I can think of, where it's this crazy California tax. We put out a map, and it turned out the public told us they were overpaying. They got the wrong tax bill.
The other thing is, so it shakes out additional sources for the story you're working on. But the other thing is, some reader or viewer will see that story and say, wow, that's a problem similar to the one I'm having. And they'll call you or contact you because you did a good job, fair job, thorough job on this issue. They'll call you and tell you about something, and you built trust with that person.
JW?
I'm sure you all would say that you don't lack for story ideas or tips. There is plenty going on in this community that we don't even get to. Your stories build other leads for other stories. You're absolutely right.
Now, JW, I did want to ask you before we finish up here today, you're teaching a class now, a journalism class, and you're doing investigative training with these young students and all. What do you tell them? Is there a future in this business? Do you encourage them to go into a career or get into the business school and get your MBA?
I pretty much give them the speech that Lori gave off the top, that you have to have special skill sets. You have to really be passionate about it. You have to be willing to pay the price. But there is an opportunity for you. The difference now is, I tell them, multiple platforms. Just think multiple platforms. Get your stories out there as many different places as you can.
Now, as politicians and head of utilities and other powerful folks see the shrinking budgets in newsrooms, they see the numbers down of numbers of reporters in papers like the UT, and that story's repeated across the country. Are they breathing easier these days? Is it?
I believe they are. We are way outnumbered when it comes to resources. Last I heard, we had something like 4 communications persons for every reporter in San Diego. And if you look at investigative reporters, it's probably 10 times that. So we're really outgunned, and they know how to do their jobs well to position their employers as best they can. So it's really difficult getting sometimes basic information out of public officials, out of institutions. I've been pestering the governor's office for almost a year now on answers related to San Onofre, and they simply don't respond.
Last word here, Joanne.
I don't mean to insult all the public relations people out there, but I know just recently I told a young reporter, you know, it's their job, this public information officer, to do what they can to make you give up. This because he was asking for some information that they wouldn't want in the public domain, and I think it's persistence and time, and just you keep going and you keep going until you finally get it.
Well, I got to thank you all for your persistence and all the great work that you do. That does wrap up our special edition here of the KPBS Roundtable on Investigative Reporting. I'd like to thank my guests, Lori Hearn of iNewsSource, investigative journalist Joanne Farian, Jeff McDonald of the San Diego Union Tribune, and J.W. August of NBC7 San Diego. A reminder, all the stories we discussed today are available on our website, kpbs.org. I'm Mark Sauer. Thanks for joining us today on the special edition of the Roundtable.